Hi, this is Steve. What I try and do in my little videos, knowing that really I am talking to myself, is to think about topics I come across on social media, but in a way that is either rarely talked about or taking a specific point, which to some may seem peripheral, but going into more depth on that point. The thing I've chosen to talk about here is a very difficult and delicate subject indeed, because it involves the tragic death by suicide of students at university. My sons are at university right now, and there but for the grace of God, etc. Of course, when you hear about a student committing suicide, the obvious response is also the only response. And by that I mean the obvious response of a combination of horror and desperate sympathy is the response which comes naturally, I hope, to everyone. However, it's also the only response, because even if there are difficult or awkward questions that raise themselves in your mind, you are simply not allowed to voice them, because both you yourself will feel guilty by doing so, but also you know the response of other people will be to deny that any difficult questions you may want to pose are legitimate, and you're merely causing the family hurt by even asking them. We all know the old saying, don't speak ill of the dead. Of course, what that really means is that someone's death and the grief that causes to their loved ones automatically precludes saying anything which would further upset them, even if it is the truth or the questions you ask are legitimate. So, as I say, I realize that I'm on somewhat delicate ground here, but I will try and say what I would like to say in a calm and non-accusatory way. What I will not do is self-censor when what I have to say I think is perfectly reasonable and rational and legitimate, and may help to stop these tragedies happening in the future. As I said, I have sons at university right now, which is maybe what has drawn me to this point. So here goes. There have been a couple of posts on Twitter recently from people who have had a child of theirs commit suicide while at university and directly blaming the university for their child's suicide. They are asking for people to sign a petition asking for the government to change the law, essentially strengthening the legal requirements within universities for welfare and support. What they don't do is give any information around the circumstances or any of the necessary background for a third party to make a rational decision, as far as they're concerned, and therefore as far as we are supposed to be concerned as well. When a student tragically takes their own life while at university, it has to be 100% the fault of the university. You are being asked to sign a petition out of emotional sympathy alone. Here, for the record, before I go on, is the government response from the Department of Education to the petition. And I quote, higher education providers do have a general duty of care to deliver educational and pastoral services to the standard of an ordinarily competent institution, and in carrying out these services, they are expected to act reasonably to protect the health, safety, and welfare of their students. This can be summed up as providers owing a duty of care to not cause harm to their students through the university's own actions. Over the last decade, higher education providers have devoted considerable resources to their student support services, and a good deal of support is now widely provided to students who struggle with their mental health. However, tragically, suicides do still occur in higher education, and investigations into the circumstances of such deaths have sometimes shown the support offered by the university was not all it might have been. We have encouraged universities to learn from such cases and redouble their prevention efforts. Former Higher Education Minister Donnellan wrote to Vice Chancellors specifically on this subject in both July 2021 and December 2021. We acknowledge the profound and lasting impact a young person's suicide has upon their family and friends, and know among the petitioners there are those who have personal experience of these devastating, tragic events. While press narratives often suggest students are an at-risk population, Office for National Statistics data, May 2022, shows a significantly lower suicide rate in higher education students compared with the wider population of similar age. This is supported by Figure 6 from the linked Office for National Statistics publication and the third bullet point at the top of the page. We therefore feel further legislation to create a statutory duty of care, where such a duty already exists, would be a disproportionate response. End of Department for Education response. I have put the Office for National Statistics data link in the description. Well, I just want to think a little bit about the psychological reaction that people have to suicide, and specifically the psychological reaction that people have to suicide of someone close to them, whether consciously or subconsciously, or a mixture of the two. The immediate reaction to someone very close to you, a parent, a sibling, a spouse, a child, or a very close friend committing suicide, must be a combination of guilt, shame, and grief. These are all completely natural emotional responses. When it is someone particularly close to you who takes their own life, these emotions must be almost unbearable. Unbearable because, of course, and this may be subconscious, what has actually been stated by the deceased person is that your presence in their life was insufficiently positive to stop them killing themselves. That's a terrible burden to bear. The guilt is almost unimaginable. It's not just that you didn't notice that they were desperately unhappy to the point of being suicidal, which is bad enough, but as I say, the thought of leaving you behind and the grief their death would cause you didn't stop them from taking this ultimate self-destructive act. As I say, the guilt must be overwhelming. Because what does that say about you? Not only were you not in touch with their feelings sufficiently to realize how desperately sad they were, but in addition, when they thought of you, your presence in their life was not deemed to be sufficiently good to overcome their despair. One of the obvious reactions to this situation is going to be a desperate need on your own part to deflect as much guilt and blame away from you and away from your now dead loved one as possible. Deflection, finger pointing, is a standard psychological coping mechanism and is again perfectly natural. The reality must be, however, that someone who is so unhappy when they are away at university that they commit suicide is someone who, within their mental makeup, had a proclivity for this level of profound despair, without at the same time having the coping mechanisms which allow the vast majority of us to ameliorate that despair, to cope with it and come through to the other side. When the only way out of your unhappiness is suicide, there has, to a degree, and I accept that that degree will be different in different people and for different circumstances, but to a degree, there must be some form of mental illness present. Otherwise, we would all be committing suicide whenever anything of any importance went wrong in our lives. What I would hope any of us would do, even looking back to when I was 18 or 19, if I was really, really unhappy about something, I would reach out to my parents and my closest friends for support. I didn't say to myself, my parents can't help me, my friends can't help me, no one can help me. And although I'm only 19 or 20 years old with my life ahead of me, all I can do is end my life because there is no possible happy future for me. That level of depression points to mental illness. Now, how that latent mental illness has been brought to the fore is another matter. I fully accept that there may be things going on at university which have caused that mental depressive proclivity to manifest itself. And I won't speculate as to what those may be because we have no information about that at all. Nevertheless, I find it hard to believe or perhaps I should say, I don't want to believe because it would be so appalling if it were true, that someone who is that desperate at university and who approaches their designated tutor and or welfare team and who openly explains to them their unhappiness and the reasons why they are unhappy, that the university authorities would literally just shrug their shoulders and say, too bad, there's nothing we can do. I just find that very hard to believe. As I say, if it is true in the cases that have been recently put on social media, then that is an absolute disgrace. I accept that completely. But I would think it more likely that the person concerned is someone who is predisposed to keep problems to themselves, who sees it as weakness to admit the level of their unhappiness. Or maybe they are worried that when they explain to someone why they are unhappy, that other person will feel that they are just being weak or pathetic and need to grow up or whatever. You also have to consider, though, that the young person who got to the point where they felt suicide was the only way out for them also didn't feel not just that they couldn't speak to anyone at the university about it, or if they had spoken to someone at the university, that they hadn't got a sufficient response from them, but they also couldn't speak about their despair to their parents, siblings, or closest friends. And that, of course, is a far bigger tragedy. It's one thing being so lacking in self-help instinct that you don't want to speak to strangers about your level of unhappiness and despair, but that you can't speak to your parents or siblings or very closest friends about it either. Now, that really is very, very sad indeed. So anyway, the point of this piece is certainly not to blame anyone, although, of course, the parents of the children spoken about on social media are absolutely 100% blaming the university authorities. You don't start up a government petition and plaster it all over social media unless you're pretty confident that it was everything to do with the university that caused the suicide. Full stop. My point is simply to say that there's far more to somebody committing suicide than being unhappy for a few weeks or months when away at university. It's not just that the university has got welfare teams and tutors who they are not only allowed to speak to, but are encouraged to speak to if they are having problems with university life for whatever reason. But of course, they can also talk to their family and friends who would give them advice and may well indeed contact the university on their behalf if they deemed it necessary or urgent. You have to think that no one would leave anyone else to their own devices if it had been made plain that they were not just not as happy as they might be, but desperately, desperately unhappy. No one surely would leave anyone, but certainly not someone who is still brain chemically an adolescent, to their own devices if they knew they were as unhappy as that. So all I'm trying to say is that suicide is always a desperately tragic thing whenever it happens. But perhaps, yes, especially in a very young person who had their life ahead of them. But simply saying it's entirely the fault of the university seems to me to be unlikely and therefore unfair. And I suspect there's a large level of deflection of the family and friends' own guilt and grief taking place when social media posts are made to that effect. So a difficult subject, and I certainly mean no disrespect. I'm just trying to look at this honestly and reasonably. You only sort problems out when you're honest about them in totality. And if there are parts of an issue which we're not allowed to speak about because it will upset somebody, then it's unlikely that we're ever going to find a path to a proper and best solution. So in summary, someone who commits suicide is clearly severely mentally unstable at that moment. And that instability is likely to have come from a latent proclivity. To get to that level of mental instability without the usual coping mechanisms, that's inbuilt. They had plenty of people both at the university and, of course, within their family and friends who they could have spoken to about it and who could or should have realized from what they were saying that this person was becoming desperate. If that young person indeed did not speak to anyone at the university, or in their family and friends, or did not speak to them in a way that was going to make it clear just how unhappy they were, then I don't think it's fair, although it's completely natural, of course, to blame anyone in particular. The university, in this circumstance, is bound both morally and to ensure it doesn't happen again, to investigate what they knew about this young person who committed suicide while at their university. If it can be clearly shown that the person did indeed ask for help and did indeed make it clear the extent of their unhappiness, but the university staff or the procedures they follow were not sufficient, then indeed action must be taken, and meaningful proper action, not merely expressions of regret. But without knowing that, for anyone to say simply, someone committed suicide at university and it is therefore entirely the fault of that university, as I say, seems to me as much as anything likely to be an emotional exercise in psychological self-preservation, because they themselves are feeling desperately guilty, grief-stricken, and ashamed that they didn't know that this was how sad their son, daughter, sibling, or close friend was. I think what this tells us is that we all have to try and bring our children up in such a way that they don't see it as weakness to admit they're having problems, and to realize that in fact, the sooner you say to someone, I'm having a problem coping, the more likely it is that the support and solutions can be found to stop that getting any worse. If you wait until you are at breaking point before you say anything, first of all, you actually may not say anything at that point, because you may have gone past the psychological point where you can say anything to anyone. And also, it may be too late because it's always possible that someone, while being sympathetic, may not understand just how bad things are for you in terms of your mental situation. So, as I said, a difficult subject, but I just wanted to put my thoughts about it down. My heartfelt sympathies are with the parents and siblings and close friends of anyone who commits suicide, but that we are probably missing part of the story and therefore part of the important solution. And if we pretend that it can only possibly be 100% the fault of, in this case, the university authorities, and that no other red flags could have been seen elsewhere, is unlikely to be true. It's a tragedy for all concerned, not just the family, but also the university staff who stand, in effect, accused of neglect, which ended in death. What I think we need is for students to be asked to sign a form when they arrive, giving the university permission to share any concerns about the health of the student, mental or physical, with the parents, and giving permission for the university to act when contacted directly by the parents if they have a mental health or welfare concern. Many of these young people are adult by law, but are still adolescents by experience, character, and mental or emotional maturity. And the parents must be part of, or at least given the opportunity to be part of, any solution to problems while their child is at university. Thanks for listening.